Hi, my name is Dennis. In this UMH video, we are going to integrate the popular Inductive Automation Ignition platform with the UMH stack. More specifically, we are going to connect Ignition to the UMH MQTT broker and visualize a couple of sensor values in the perspective module to build a nice dashboard that we can share in a web browser. Now, to follow along in this video, there's a couple things you will need. First of all, you will need a working installation of the UMH. In my case, I have the UMH running in a Flatcar VM in Linux on Proxmox with the IP address that you can see here and that we will need later. The second thing that you will need is Ignition, and it consists of a couple of components. The first one is the Ignition gateway, which I have running here on localhost 8088. And we will also need the Ignition designer, which we will, which you also can install separately. Note that they have a Ignition has a maker license, which allows you to create free projects as long as they are non-commercial. So all the components are essentially free that you will need to use today. All right, let's get started. There is in fact a third thing that we will need in order to connect to the MQTT broker of the UMH, and that's a third-party module for Ignition that you can find here. I will share the link below in the video. And the module that we will need to download and install is called the MQTT Engine module. Now go ahead and download this. When you download this for the first time, you will probably have to put in your contact information, but otherwise it's completely free. And to install the module into Ignition, we have to go to Config, to Modules, and here we see all the modules which are enabled and installed by default, provided by Inductive Automation. We can also install additional modules. We click on Install, Browse on your computer, and under Downloads, I have the downloaded MQTT Engine module. Go ahead and open it and install. Again, if it's the first time, you will probably have to read a end-user license agreement and accept it. I have already done that. Nevertheless, you can see we have under Cirrus Link Solutions LLC, the MQTT Engine with an activated license and a running state, which means we can start to use it. Now, to use the module effectively, we first have to configure it. And we see that we now have the MQTT Engine as a setting option in the gateway. So let's go to Settings. And there's two things we have to configure. First of all, we have to specify the address of the MQTT broker in the UMH stack. So let's create a new MQTT server setting. I will just call mine the UMH. The URL of the MQTT server can be found from the IP address of the Flatcar VM. And we're going to use the TCP protocol, which means it's non-encrypted instead of SSL. So let me go ahead and type TCP. And if I look back to my virtual machine, the IP address was 192.168.178.169. So this is the IP address on which my Flatcar VM runs and on which the MQTT broker can be reached. So let me type that in. 192.168.178.169. And the port is the default port for an MQTT broker, namely 1883. The username is core, and the password is UMH, which can be found in the documentation of the United Manufacturing Hub website. Right, so we have configured the address of our broker. Create. The second thing we have to configure is a namespace. This is essentially the namespace inside Ignition in which the tags will be published. So we're going to create a custom namespace. Let's create one. Again, I'm gonna be original and just call mine the UMH. And here we have to give a comma-separated list of all the topics that are of interest from us, to us from the UMH. And essentially, I'm just going to use the wildcard hashtag, which will give us all the topics which are on the broker of the UMH. There's a couple of optional settings which I really recommend you to configure. The root tag folder will be the name of the folder in which the tags will be published in Ignition. So I will call mine UMH so that later when I'm working in the Ignition designer, I know in which folder to look for to find my tags. A tag name we can leave blank. JSON payload we can also leave blank. So let's create a new custom namespace. And that's it. So we have installed and configured the MQTT Engine module. And now if we navigate to our Ignition designer, I have here my local host. I can click on that. And one thing I personally struggle a bit with Ignition is that the font is just really small on my system, which is why in the bottom right corner of my screen, I have a magnifier glass. So you can see the area around my mouse in a bigger size for better readability. Let's go ahead and log in, username, password. And I currently have no projects. So let's go ahead and create a new project. I will call my project UMH again. We can leave the rest of the options default. And let's go ahead and create a new project. It's currently loading. Right, here we are. And this is essentially the main window of the Ignition designer. Now, there are a lot of good videos about how to use the Ignition designer. The documentation on the Inductive Automation website is also pretty good. So I'm not going to delve into too much detail and assume you have some basic knowledge of the designer. Nevertheless, let me give you a quick overview, at least of the important panes that we will use in the video. So in the top left, we have essentially an overview of the modules that we will use in Ignition. And in the later part of the video, we will mostly rely on the perspective module, which is Ignition's new vision module. And it's optimized for displaying also on mobile devices, which I think is pretty cool. Right. Here in the bottom left, we have an overview of our data, which is called tags in Ignition. And in the right, we have the properties of the perspective. So this will be mostly used when we are going to build the actual dashboard. For now, let's see if we can actually find and see the tags of the UMH in our Ignition designer. So for this, I changed the browser from default to MQTT Engine, which became available after we installed the module. And indeed, I see that in the bottom, I have in my root the folder UMH. Let's go ahead and open it. And if you're familiar with the UMH stack, you may already recognize that IA has the folder raw and development. And there we see indeed under IoT sensors are values for humidity, pressure, and temperature, which are also changing here in real time. So we can now use these values to build a cool dashboard in the next part of the video. Okay, so in this part we are going to construct the actual dashboard to visualize our MQTT sensor data that you can see here below and that we configured in the previous part of the video. For this we're going to use the perspective module, which is a default module in Ignition. And it's the new vision module that allows to create interactive dashboards that are visible in a web browser, but also can scale very nicely to portable devices like tablets and smartphones. Again, I will not go into too much detail of how to construct dashboards in Ignition. Instead, I will share a couple of very cool resources that I've used myself. In this video, we are really more interested in how to visualize MQTT data coming from the United Manufacturing Hub. Okay, let's get down to it. In perspective, we're going to navigate to views and we're going to create a new view. Let's give it the name dashboard. And as a root container type, we're going to use a coordinate container, which is one of the available container types in Ignition. And this is the most basic container that will be static. Create view. And we see indeed that now we have our root container here. And this is our pane in which we will design our components. Let's make it a bit bigger for now. Okay, so for the dashboard, I will want to visualize two things. I want to have a nice component that shows me the temperature value here. And let's also visualize the humidity value, which is a value in percentage between 0 and 100%. So we have two components. Therefore, let's create two additional containers, one for each component. And the way we do this is by navigating all the way to the right. We have this hidden pane here called perspective components. And if I hover over it, I will see all the potential components that I can use to put on under my root container. So I'm looking for a coordinate container with fixed coordinates. So that's this one here. I'm going to take it and I'm going to drag it over here. And now we see that under root we have this new coordinate container. We click on it. So now it's selected, and in the perspective property editor we can see and edit its properties. So the first thing I want to change is I want to define proper coordinates so that the component is nicely located on my screen. The X and Y component I will change both to 50 so that the container will be in the top left corner of my screen. And let's give it a width and a height of 400. So it will be a square container. One more thing I would like to change is I want to give it a more telling name. So I'm going to call this my temperature container. Like so. Okay, that looks good. Let me add a second container for our humidity component. Again, I navigate to the perspective components tab, select a fixed container and drag it on my root container. Again, I can see it here. Let's edit the properties in the same way. In the perspective property editor, let's think about the X coordinate. I want to have a distance of 50 between both containers. And the first one already had a distance of 50 from the border and has a width of 400, which means that the X coordinate of this container will be 50 plus 400, which is 500 here. And we can keep the Y component the same, 50, so it can be the same height. And the width of the component will be 400 and 400 of the container, because I want to have the same size. So let's see what this looks like. You see I have the two containers nicely next to each other, and we can essentially make our root container a bit smaller. I will make mine about 500 here and 1000. Let's see what it looks like. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Actually, I can make it 900. There we go. 900 and 500, as you can see here. Okay, so now we have our two containers. Let's make it a bit bigger after all. 950. Yeah, that looks clean. Right, so let's add the actual components now. On the left, I will have my temperature component. So it will be a display that will show the current value of the MQTT sensor for temperature. And if I navigate again to the perspective components window, for the temperature, Ignition provides a very nice thermometer component that I can drag on the temperature container. Now be mindful that you have to double click on the container before you do this to make sure the thermometer lands under it. Right, let's put it a bit more in the center and make it a bit bigger. Yep, I think this looks nice, like this. And there we go. Now we have the component of the for the temperature. Now, if I click on its properties and navigate to the right, I see that I have a higher bound of 100, which is fine, a lower bound of 0, and the value is currently a constant. It's 25. But we want to display our MQTT tag. To do this, we are going to add a binding. Now, if you notice, next to the value 25, you see a link icon, which allows us to specify a binding. And a binding is essentially you binding a certain object to this value. By clicking on it, you have a binding time selection window. And as you may have guessed, we are going to bind a tag to this value. And we're going to bind the temperature tag. So if we go all the way to the right, to this label icon, we can navigate to this particular MQTT tag that we have loaded in the previous part of the video. Under UMH in our root folder, we have this folder, raw development, IoT sensor, and here we have the temperature tag that we want to use for this value. So I'm gonna go ahead and select that and click on OK. And I'm gonna copy this value because we're gonna reuse the text for the humidity sensor in the next part. Let's see what it looks like. So I'm gonna click on apply and OK. And now we see that indeed the value is a really long number. And if I look at the property editor, I see that now the link icon is blue, which means that the binding is active. There's a problem though. If I look here on the right, I see that I have a warning icon, and essentially it tells me that it expects a number but has found a string. So let's edit this binding a little bit. We're gonna have to add a transformation to it. So click on add transform, and the transformation that I will use is just a formatting. Essentially, I will transform a input value, which can be a string, and evaluate this as a number and also truncate it so I don't see that many values. So let me click on add transform. And now if I move myself a little bit up and go to the bottom left corner, you see it in the binding preview. The tag has changed from 48 dot, a super long decimal chain, into just 3 decimal numbers. This should look a lot better. Let me click on OK. And now if I navigate to the thermometer, I see that indeed I have a nice looking thermometer that shows me the temperature value in real time. Okay, now let's do the same thing for the humidity. Let's select the humidity container by double clicking on it. So now we can drag a component into this container. I'm going to the right, the perspective components window. And given that the humidity is a value in percent, so it's between 0 and 100, I think I will use a progress bar. So let me drag this progress bar into the container, fix its positioning, make it a bit bigger, like that. I think that looks nice. And just as with the temperature, we can go to the property editor. The min and max is okay, 0 to 100, but the value is a constant. We're going to add a binding by clicking on the link icon. Again, we're gonna go to the tag, and remember earlier I copied the path to the temperature binding, so I can just rename it to humidity, like this, and click on OK. Apply, OK, and there we go. We see that we have now the coloring now reflects the humidity. To make it a bit more clear, let's add the value as well so that we can see it on the component. For this, we navigate to the properties again and look for the property value display, which is currently not enabled. So let's enable it. And now we see that we get the actual value in percent as well. Okay, I think this is it for the dashboard. This should be sufficient to illustrate how it works. Now let's deploy it on the ignition gateway. For this, we just have to save the project. So click on the save icon in the top left. And that's it really. Let me navigate back to my gateway. If I go to home, under the section run it, I can see my projects. I have just one project, the UMH. And now when I launch it, it shows me this dashboard automatically. And the neat thing is, this is really just in my web browser, so localhost 88, under the UMH project. And we see that we have this nice two sensors or components that show the sensor value for the temperature and the humidity in real time. Now, of course, there's a lot more that you can do with Ignition. You can even make it interactive. You can even create buttons that send messages to the broker. But for now, I just wanted to illustrate how you can integrate Ignition with the UMH stack, read its MQTT values from the broker, and then display them in a simple dashboard like this. Good luck with your own constructions. Thank you for watching this video.